This is an audio recording of It Was 100 Days, written by Kat Edwinson and narrated by the author. Being a parable about the end of the era of fossil fuels and our journey out of darkness. This story is a work of fiction. All names, characters, places, and incidents are either the product of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Copyright 2025 by Kat Edwinson. A note to the future. My name is Cougar. As I write this, it was just over 100 days ago that the modern human world, as it was experienced at the time, came to its final, crashing, ringing conclusion. We didn't realize at first that modernity was toast. By 100 days into it, we certainly did. It was a long process of letting go, but by 100 days in, we were collectively begun to look to the future and not the past. The past had died, in fire and freeze, in wind and rain. In our thoughts, both bright and dark, it died. Until finally we had let go of it, as one lets go of a dead thing. In a dismal way, it was liberating. A pure experience of renewed purpose. At around 100 days, we were all in. And so, this story, or journalistic account, or whatever it is. The stimulus to create and polish this memoir came to me from a visitor who arrived a few days ago. An elderly woman calling herself Brigid. Something of a traveling bard, I suppose. She arrived bringing news from the wider world, not all of it bad, and in any case more than we might have had otherwise. In exchange for news, she accepted a meal and then wanted to hear the story of how we had managed to survive and thrive. I hauled out my laptop computer and started summarizing from my rough notes. After listening for a while, she said she would like a copy sent her way, as she was collecting narrative accounts for some planned greater work. We had restored limited internet access a while back. Email was working for certain address spaces, so I was only too happy to make the effort. I said it might take a few days to pull all my notes together. Brigid said she would wait. She is, even now, sitting and drinking lemonade in a bent wood rocker in the garden, no doubt making sure I stick to it. That's fine. Working under a deadline is often a good thing. I've endured a lot of critical deadlines already, as well as many dead, and for the first time in a long time, I'm thinking about both of these as I try to work out what I should say regarding how we experienced the end of the world. It's been hard, as history can be, when you are fighting for a place in it. On the worst days, I found myself reminded of the saying you hear about war, about how it's the dead who are the lucky ones. Anytime I let my mind drift that direction, I remind myself it's not true. For anyone reading these words, the fight has been years, probably long decades unfolding. Heck, it might even be 100 years. And from that far away, you likely think this story is all curious, antiquarian drivel. But in 100 of our days, 100 things that seemed impossible had already grown and bloomed. And since you are reading this, wherever and whenever you are, you already know that somehow it all worked out. On the other paw, if nobody reads this, then I guess it means we were too stupid to live, or that Brigid failed in her mission. But no, I want this account of events to reflect survival, even if we didn't, and resilience, even if we weren't. I believe we will somehow endure, and so far we have. To give the most concise account, I've decided to review and clean up my journal notes before handing them over. There are calendar gaps in my narration, days when, for various reasons, that will make sense in context, I could set down little or nothing. After some consideration, I have left these gaps, and the other half-formed thoughts, as they happened at the time. These are the darker places in the journey, dominated by shadows and signs of emptiness and hesitation. They are presented in the pages that follow, mostly as these were written at the time. The empty places in the story are also the places where people died and left the story for others to finish. That anyone survived to continue the account, that it did not end, that is what they call a contingent fact of history. I have an ask. Where there are gaps, be still for a moment. If you are very still and listen, you might hear the voices of the lost. They too have something to say, and in their way, the dead are always with us. Some of the dead were what civilized people would have labeled as evil. I often thought that way at the time, but I have since forgiven all. They were just people, afraid and confused and lost, who fairly frequently had lost their minds just before they lost their lives. Is abandoning all hope at the approach of death an unforgivable sin? If I can now spare a comforting thought for the wicked, then so can you, dear reader. When it comes right down to it, we were all of us wicked at the beginning of the end of the world. Day 0, a fairy tale. Where to start? Once upon a time, we were greedy and envious, and our attention was consumed by distractions. In our fascination with ourselves, we did not see what was visible in front of us, though we saw clearly enough once reality had decided to destroy us. We still sometimes argue about what constitutes reality. For starters, there was legitimate disagreement over when day 1 of the collapse actually arrived. In this chapter, which I am calling Day 0, I'll be using my personal yardstick to decide when the bridge linking us all to the past fell into the chasm, taking nearly everything and everyone we once knew with it. There were countless loose threads that needed to come apart on the way down, and plenty of other things that needed to break for the collapse to gain momentum. That it did collapse is beyond doubt. To recognize the complex nature of global collapse, I'm here going to add a Day 0 chapter as a placeholder for everything that leads up to the end of the modern world. It's odd to say it now, but looking back, I realize that nearly nobody was watching when the human world finally ran out of runway. There were people writing on the internet who said things were about to blow up. I listened, and their warnings helped me and others to make sense of things and to prepare. Those voices are gone now, of course. I hope it worked out for them. I hope they took their own advice and survived. Even allowing for the clarity of hindsight, we still can't entirely agree on when Day 1 of global collapse, or the big slide as some are calling it, really kicked off. It was less a single day of seismic changes and more a month, or maybe a year previous, or several, who can say? But on Day 1, it hit like a meteor. August began under a lot of uncertainty. To an unbiased observer, global civilization was clearly tearing itself apart. To start with, the weather in the northern hemisphere had been terrible. It would be difficult to even call it weather, as the Earth system was definitely derailing. I knew what that meant because I had understood for a long time the role global heating would play in breaking the old and established expectations about world phenomena. Nobody seems to have noticed at the time it was happening, but the onrushing collapse of the Earth's climatic system was gathering steam. It was not supposed to happen like that, certainly not so soon, nor so violently, but the planetary physics never cared what we wanted. Denial of these things took us exactly nowhere. When the excess energy was too much to contain, the planetary climate machine exploded into spinning, lacerating shrapnel, taking the built human world, the only world any of us had ever known, with it. At the same time, and I will always maintain as a direct result, that all this unwinding calamity hit us, there were scattered armed conflicts brewing across the continents. Refugees fleeing the early turmoil caused by a derailing climactic system forced their way across borders into countries that did not want them. Nobody knew what to do with this wave of human suffering. Eventually, they became the excuse to promote totalitarian regimes and intolerance, leading, as always, to war. In rode the 4 horsemen of the end times, War, famine, pestilence, and that other guy. Conquest? How is that not the same as war? Anyway, it was mostly global heating at work, tearing apart all our carefully organized modern solutions to humanity's increasing problems. The wars and conquests were just along for the ride, mostly as distractions from the real show. The real show was the end of the human world, but we didn't appreciate that at the time. The distractions worked as advertised. The Koreans were going at it again. The North had sent 30,000 artillery shells into the South. Seoul, dealing with their own economic difficulties and needing a distraction, answered in kind to much rattling of nuclear sabers. There was talk at the time of an impending invasion from the North, and the South was threatening to use their significant cache of nuclear weapons to deal with it. How that turned out, we'll never know. The chimes had landed on Kinmen Island a year before, and then instigated a blockade of Taiwan. A month after that, the Russians had driven tanks and troops a short distance into both Finland and Estonia, and were making a grab for the Suwalki Gap from the direction of Belarus. A large explosion near the frontier town of Tartu in Estonia was rumored to have been a tactical nuke, but nobody could prove it because the Russians declared Estonia a no-fly zone. This was causing a predictable, if cautious, ruckus within NATO. It was all very disturbing, and I began considering what might be the implications of global war. It did not take long to find out. The first verified nuclear exchange was between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was in late August. The two nations had been exchanging threats and naval ambushes for months, so we knew there were problems coming. When a critical Saudi oil terminal in the Gulf was suddenly and mysteriously vaporized. After some confusion and unhelpful reassurances, the U.S. government revealed that a primitive nuclear device had been used against the Saudis, probably delivered by a cargo ship via Indonesia. 2 days later, there was a retaliatory strike against the primary Iranian oil terminal on Karg Island. Nobody knows if that attack was nuclear or conventional, or who was responsible. Nor will we ever know, as that's when the news embargoes started. Of course, Russia had something to say about all this, and China as well. The usual finger-pointing about Western provocations. More big words about bigger conspiracies and inevitable consequences, multipolar threats. And then, nothing. No news reports of anything. Here's hoping they all had fun. Nobody around here cares. Not since day one. What can be said of these guns of August? World War III both began and ended in less than a week. We think it ended. It's hard to say. It seems like the nuclear players did their atomic boogie for a week. Here in our little village, a tiny portion of what was once an important city, we have no clear idea what the actual damage was. It couldn't have been too bad because we're still here. My mail-order Geiger tube dosimeter hasn't made a peep the entire time, so that's encouraging. Or maybe it's just cheap junk. Anyway, radiation toxicity has yet to be a problem here, so we'll take that as a relative win. Another thing that happened about this time was the global internet went down. At least as a global communications network, it went away. Services inside the United States were still available, but if you had any digital business on another continent, then forget it. I remember reading just one news article, again, nobody wanted to talk about this, about how a large portion of the undersea cables failed all at once. My first thought was sabotage. On the internet, people were screwing on their tinfoil hats and speaking darkly of the internet kill switch. It wasn't as complex as that. The Russians, Chinese, and Koreans had been loitering their so-called fishing fleets around undersea cables for 2 years, sometimes accidentally dragging their ship anchors through them. So sorry. Everyone thought the belligerent parties were snooping in on traffic moving on the cables. Maybe they were, but it seems now they were also setting remote explosive charges against the day when they wanted to halt overseas communication. That would still leave network satellites, but those were always vulnerable to attack. Probably some combination of high-energy lasers from the ground and high-altitude kinetic kill vehicles on rockets took out most of the comm satellites orbiting in low Earth orbit. Neither the undersea cables nor the orbital assets would be completely replaceable in under a decade, even with every technology and funding source available to hand. So that was that. The internet was dead. I hope it was worth it. Hey, at least the Korean and Russian hackers are out of work now. Nice job, you turd sandwiches. Global crude oil movement entered a critical decline sometime during the economic blockades and nuclear exchanges, from what little the news said about any of it. Looking back, it's almost as if they didn't want us to think clearly about that part. Harder to hide, though, was when service stations started to shutter themselves in the few weeks leading up to day one. No gas, no diesel, and later on, no propane. One day they were there, the next day they were intermittent, and the next time you looked, they were shut. It took 2 weeks for the crude oil economy to collapse. What a shock. It was about this time when the crazies started to lose their minds. In retrospect, I should have seen that coming. Oil was the sticky, toxic glue that held our rotting world together. Until the last hours of day zero, everything that anyone wanted or needed at any time, from any direction, was satisfied courtesy of fossil fuels. Turns out, crude oil was also the thread that kept some people's minds from unraveling. When the gasoline supply became intermittent, the most vulnerable among us, and the least resilient, came apart at the seams, as did everything else in short order. So it's difficult to blame them for having a weakness of the mind. All of us were blindsided. Nobody knew what to do, what to think, or what it all meant. The mainstream media was a lot more interested in the resulting collapse of the oil economy than they were about any nuclear exchanges between nations. Nations that most Americans couldn't find on a map, so I guess that makes sense. It's interesting now to reflect on how the most feared event anyone could ever imagine, a global nuclear exchange, barely made the news. But we'll never forget the day when the gas stations closed. Never. Unless you were among those being vaporized, World War III turned out to be the least of our challenges. And honestly, was nuclear war ever a challenge to anyone? Once you vaporize, your personal problems are over. In the run-up to day one, it was nothing but problems, and none of them had obvious solutions. The scramble was on to secure food, fuel, clothing, and weapons ahead of an expected collapse in supply chains caused by the lack of fuel resources. That lesson about supply chains we learned in a kind of preview of coming attractions during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic. News outlets and social media took perverse delight in showing us how poorly people were coping during day zero. Looting, shootings, arson. The most disturbing to me were the cult-like mass suicides and ritualized murder being reported in gruesome, gleeful detail on social networks. As I mentioned before, when the fuel supply collapsed, the least stable and most conspiratorial parts of the country let themselves go over to the dark side. The cult of oil worship was always a death cult. Like all such cults, the worship of oil ended when it murdered its adherents. These days, I don't like to think about that chapter. For my part, I did not witness very much of it. For me and my neighbors, the rise of rampant cruelty and abject insanity was mostly an unverified rumor, reinforced by events that came to us by night, or later, when finding loose heaps of rodent-chewed bones still dressed in rags that were once clothing. It felt like a wave of shadows spread over the land, like ring wraiths out of a Tolkien-esque fantasy, hunting elves and men. My neighbors and I had our walls built early, and we stayed behind them, thus avoiding most of the madness. Most, but not all. Okay, enough of memory lane. It was bad. It was scary, and at times it felt demonic. Some people lost their minds, but not everyone, and that was just the opening act. Nobody, and I mean nobody, expected day one to happen the way it did. Note to Brigid. Since we recently restored limited internet access, I uncovered some data and discussion concerning the cost and availability of crude oil during the collapse. I found it interesting and thought you might as well. And it is relevant to some of this narrative. I'll be including oil prices and fuel availability information where it makes sense. On day one, the price of oil had hit $103 per barrel. That was up from an average of about $85 in the months leading up to the global collapse. Okay, back to the journalism. Day one. Surprises. With all the geopolitical monkey business afoot, I decided to stock up on some essentials. I knew global supply chains might be tanked for a while, as seems to happen. That's some of what we learned from the COVID-19 pandemic. I had planned to gas up the old Dodge on the way to Home Depot when I discovered the local service station was packed with others having the same idea, with vehicles in a line out to the street. I slow drove past this, taking a close look, and it looked crazy. People were filling up their vehicles and gas cans, even 1-gallon milk jugs. Some were arguing about their order in line, and others were fighting over access to the gas nozzles. Lots of tension and red faces. It reminded me of the opening minutes of a Hollywood zombie movie. With all that going on, and I was still thinking of zombies, I decided to try another service station I knew was further up the road, near the airport, but still on my way to the hardware store. That worked out better. While I was there, I asked a guy filling up his truck and a portable generator what he thought was up with everyone lining up for fuel. He told me that the internet rumor was going around about how, due to the wars in the oil patches, the government was preparing to ration gas. It might be time to take this seriously, I recall thinking. The lines at Home Depot were deep on day one, with shopping carts full to the brim. I saw people were buying a lot of bleach and plastic sheeting and tape. There were plenty of loads of plywood and lumber, too. This didn't make much sense to me at the time. It's not like we were expecting a hurricane or flood. Even so, I bought a little more stuff than I had planned, including a few rolls of duct tape and some bleach. The smartest thing I did that day was buy a haul of heirloom seeds from a kiosk near the garden department. I figured if there were to be a serious global shootout, the first thing to break down would be food supply chains. I got home without any issues. The traffic was bonkers on day one. Funny, it's months later, and traffic like that would now be a welcome sign of normalcy. Note to Brigid, the price of oil ended the day at $120 per barrel. Day 2. Dawning awareness. The next day I worked on projects around the house with an eye toward tightening things up, fixing anything broken, and such like. I kept an eye on the news feeds rolling in on my phone every few minutes and eventually tuned my shop radio to a local station. The national news was bad and getting worse by the hour. There was a major war taking place on the Korean Peninsula, and troops from either Russia or China had landed on some Japanese islands. The Saudi royal family had gone into hiding. China was sinking ships around Taiwan. In the afternoon, my wife and I had a sit-down discussion concerning events in the world and where we stood. I decided to hit the bank for $500 cash and to do that daily for a few days, or until I ran out of money. I try to keep a few thousand in cash in the house at all times anyway, but if things were set to derail, then more cash on hand seemed like a smart bet. The wife planned to go shopping and stock up on some canned foods and supplies. Afterward, I got on the internet, hit a familiar food distributor in Orange County, and ordered some things in bulk I knew the stores wouldn't have for long. We bulk order about twice a year. Rice, beans in several varieties, nuts that store well, dried fruits, wheat berries for flour, field corn for cornmeal, rolled oats, and other such staples we've become accustomed to. It's partly about disaster planning in earthquake-prone California, but mostly because we like the convenience of having raw materials for food in the basement. The bulk order would take a week to arrive by freight. I figured that would be plenty of time. It did not yet occur to me that trucking would already be a problem. Note to Brigid, the price of oil ended the day at $126 per barrel. Day 3. On the run. On the morning of day 3, my daily news feed had some items about riots, mostly in Europe and Asia. Likely the rest of the world was in the same fix, but didn't merit coverage. From the reporting, it sounded like people were wanting mostly food and fuel supplies. Large numbers of others were trying to go places, were being turned back, and were none too happy. As such, there were angry crowds reported near rail stations, airline access, and ship and ferry access. Anything that moved had considerable crowds trying to get away. People were on the run. The ferries were packed enough that 2 had tipped over, both of these in India, with significant loss of life. The Paris suburbs were lit up with street fighting and clashes with police. No idea what that was about. It seems to happen there a lot. It was just another data point suggesting that people were starting to panic. My wife had a conversation with our Costa Rican neighbors named Mora. I was in the basement at the time laying up water storage in some food-grade barrels we have for collecting rainwater. I heard about the neighbors later. The young woman next door, living with her working-class parents, was missing her husband, who worked in construction. I had met him a few times before. I didn't know much about him. He seemed like a good guy. A month before, he had taken a job in another city a few hours' drive away and was staying there in some temporary housing until he got paid a few times. He wouldn't get back for another several weeks. His wife had their new baby with her and was fretting because he hadn't called in days, and they were running short of money and food. They were 2 weeks behind on the rent and were afraid of eviction. My wife told her how, if their family needed anything, they should just come to the house. To the young woman's credit, she said that she would. They are nice people, and I hate to see young couples with children struggling too much, and the elders have always been friendly and hard-working. This reminded me of the food order I had placed. I was having an odd feeling it might not be coming together. I promised myself I would check in on it the next day. Day 4. The wheels come off. 4 days into the big slide, we had the first signs that things were going sideways, and in a big way. There were columns of smoke in the south of the city. Plenty of people lived down that way. Sprawling suburbs, most of them well off. You wouldn't expect many problems. From the sound of sirens coming from all directions, lasting for 2 hours, it was likely all hands on deck down there. The local fire stations emptied. We could hear the sirens, and for an hour after that, there was a constant stream of sirens headed south. I never heard what that was about, but I could guess as well as anyone else. It made me think about the long lines at the service station and the shouted arguments about privilege. I went inside later and did an internet search for a good police band radio scanner. Toward nightfall, I learned from a passing neighbor that there were no longer any operating service stations in the area, and that earlier in the day he had driven almost 30 miles to fill up his car. On day 4, the wheels were coming off. Day 5. Exploring options. Having no errands to run, I stayed home and monitored the news reports. While working out in front of the house, I had a conversation with a guy passing by walking his dog. He asked if I knew anywhere he could buy gasoline. I said I did not. Then he asked me if I had any I could sell. I said I did not, and good luck. I shouldn't have been bothered by it, but with everything else going on, it made me nervous. It told me that people were beginning to explore their options, so to speak. The wife and I discussed the situation still evolving next door. She had gone to their house to see if anything had changed and discovered they were being evicted the next day due to non-payment of the rent. After some thought, I felt like we should make preparations to feed a crowd. I mentioned the food order I had placed earlier, and she agreed that had been a good call. Afterward, she went to the thrift store to see if they had mattresses in good repair and baby clothes, just because. I spent the middle part of the day clearing some space on the back patio and bringing in a few pieces of lawn furniture. If need be, the neighbors could stay there until something else could be sorted out. I called the food distributor in Orange County to politely inquire about my shipment. My hunch was right. They were having trouble finding a hauler. I asked if a bit more money would solve the problem, and he said that wasn't how they did business. My bad. I clarified that I would pay whatever additional fee the shipper needed to prioritize an order, and he said he appreciated the sentiment. He guessed at a figure. I authorized 50% above that and said he should keep any remainder for his trouble. Finally, I thanked him for the many years of friendly and helpful service, with the hope we would be doing more business in the future. After I hung up, I had a premonition that I'd never hear from him again. Events in Southern California were likely to get real hot very fast. The story of Southern California. Note for Brigid. I'm going to interrupt the flow of the storytelling here for some specific commentary on the situation in Southern California up to and during the collapse of civilization. This sub-story format is not the story of our village. We are not located in SoCal. However, I am a scientist still, in spirit if not in practice. I think the scientific community can share part of the blame for what happened in the human world. We dropped the ball. We knew what was happening. We knew what was coming. We knew everything of importance, or could have made informed guesses. As a community, we said next to nothing about what we knew. I can tell you why that was. It was because climate research was a job, a career, a way to support your family. Based on the universal principle of not biting the hand that feeds you, scientists communicating their work in an alarming way were seen to be a career-limiting move. Most scientists took funding from universities, governments, or businesses, all of whom had a direct vested interest in what scientists themselves derisively called BAU, or business as usual. It was called that because absolutely everybody at the top was in some kind of business. The business of climate research was to conduct a serious study of the problem on the one hand and downplay the same problem as much as possible on the other. The elites knew what was happening, of course. They read the scientific papers they paid to have produced, and they understood and accepted the threat, even as they told everyone else that it was all a hoax. They thought to use that information asymmetrically to get themselves and their wealth and power out of the way of global heating, climate change, and the inevitable collapse of the global economic and political system. It was an evil plan because it would cause most people to suffer and die eventually, but it was the only plan they could accept. Have you, during your travels, heard anything about the Freedom City movement being planned by the global elites during all four of the Trump, Vance, Johnson administrations? The wealthy understood what was coming and knew enough to get out of the way. But I don't think they built any of these cities. I bet a cup of coffee, being worth its weight in gold these days, that they failed utterly. Everything came on too fast. They probably didn't believe most of it anyway, because science. So, just like the rest of us, they ran out of time. The scientists studying the climate crisis accepted too well their important role in sandbagging their work results, and then did so good a job at this that their paymasters were caught as unaware as everyone else. If there is an Earth goddess, I'm sure she is laughing herself silly about now. With all that as background, I want to write this narrative about why the elites needed to escape and what they were escaping from. I'm using the example of Southern California as a story arc. Some of what I can share here is based more on later experiences than on some kind of predictive power on my part. That said, everything I will share here could have been easily predicted and should have been. The climate science was known. The infrastructure problems were understood. The difficulty evacuating and relocating people quickly was a proven fact. In the end, people were deliberately abandoned by their leaders. In every practical way, on day one, they were murdered. I have never met anyone who has successfully escaped the Southern California megalopolis. My guess is none did. This needs an explanation. Humanity in modern times, meaning the times that are forever behind us, lived in what had been called a built environment. It was not a natural environment, but one that was completely artificial and maintained by technology and fossil fuels. The built environment was composed of millions, if not tens of millions, of moving parts that had to be kept moving day and night, without interruption, just to support human life inside the built environment. Their artificial habitat needed constant inputs from outside itself, inputs of electricity, water, food deliveries, fuel supply, medicines, and a million other things, large and small. Virtually nothing could be entirely created inside the built environment. For example, while you could bake fresh bread at home, you could not grow wheat for flour. If you had wheat, you were unable to mill it without electricity. You would need an oven to cook the bread. While you could sell fruits and vegetables at a sidewalk market, those items were delivered every day into the built environment from hundreds or thousands of miles away, mediated by freeway transportation requiring fossil fuels. Electricity and water supplies had the same problem. They were impossible without advanced technology and fossil fuels. And while California had its oil and gas industries, most of the actual fuels found in urban areas were refined and shipped in from all over the world. The natural gas supply in California was delivered via extensive pipelines and processing facilities, the parts for which came from all over the world, and all of it operated using electricity from the grid. 10 million moving parts, whose design, manufacture, delivery, maintenance, and repair depended on uninterrupted inputs of fossil fuels all the time, every day, forever. Embedded in all this were the people necessary to make it all work. People with special skills and experiences, using specialized equipment, who kept the entire cathedral of technology open for business all day, every day, without pause. These people drove on the freeways every day, shopped in the markets, and had homes and families in the suburbs. When the cracks began to form, they stayed home, like everyone else did, at which point the cracks dominated until the entire built environment fell to ruin. I was not there when it all blew up, but I did not need to be there to know what happened. The larger the built environment, the more completely it imploded. This is one of the perverse aspects of physics that people did not anticipate because people had never known and could not understand failure on this scale. Of course, most of the people in Southern California had no idea that any of this was going on, not the good nor the bad. The great virtue of the constant effort to maintain modernity was that it was almost, if not completely, invisible to the vast majority of end users. People didn't know, except in a vague way, where their food and water came from, nor did they give this any focused consideration. Same with electricity. People had no visibility into the built environment. They lived inside it, but except when it broke in spectacular fashion, they had no idea it was there. They also had little to no relationship with the natural environment and none at all with the Earth's dynamic system of systems within which they existed. When the massive changes began, when the air became too hot to breathe, when the fires burned like a furnace day and night for months, they simply didn't recognize any of it as being real. The AC worked, and the firefighters came when you called, so everything was fine, right? This was nowhere more true than in Southern California. The built environment there was all along a death trap. A death trap is a kind of trap that, once you fall into it, you can neither get out nor survive. Once in a death trap, you die. Southern California had been a death trap for probably 100 years. Generations of people had been born into the trap and lived their entire lives there without ever realizing that if things broke down, they would likely perish in place, and quickly. Sometime during the early days of the big slide, people must have suddenly understood that they were trapped. It didn't matter that they understood, or when they understood this. For most of them, it was already too late, and had been too late for a generation or more. There had been a few early warnings pointing to this, but I was acutely aware many years before that nobody had learned from those examples. The decade of intense SoCal fires, the landslides, the heat waves, and concurrent energy supply interruptions, all of it passed without notice, like water under a bridge. Entire communities had been destroyed by the fires, giving people a small taste of how well their world held up to massive dislocations. What they mostly learned was that it didn't hold up at all. If you had a lot of money, you could save yourself. If you didn't, then you were wiped out. But what could they do? Nothing. So instead, they forgot about it and hoped for the best. Nothing was said, nobody learned any important lessons, and nothing changed. Average people might have been defenseless, but the powerful and wealthy were not. The first indication of a systemic problem was the abrupt exit of nearly the entire insurance industry serving California. Insurance companies were always in the business of understanding and distributing risk, and made no allowance for ideology or political niceties when setting rates. When things began to blow apart in SoCal, the insurance industry operations for the entire state of California folded up. They folded up when mountain communities, often prime real estate, began to burn up regularly. The Camp Fire, the Palisades and Eaton fires, and the many fires and landslides in Malibu. These and many more essentially wiped out the property insurers in California. In a single year of massive urban and wildland fires, the entire industry lost 20 years of profits. They were financially eviscerated. People approached all this as if it were primarily an economic problem, a matter of money. What almost nobody understood was that it was a huge problem with the built environment, a problem with physics. It was all a trap, and the insurance industry giants were the first to discover this. During the many fires, people waited too long to evacuate, and then found the roads unpassable due to flames, smoke, and abandoned vehicles. In the Palisades fire, first responders had to use bulldozers to clear the road of all the abandoned cars left by people trying to outrun the flames, eventually having to escape on foot. In the Camp Fire, the few roads out of the city of Paradise were immediately blocked in the same way. Nearly 100 people died in their cars, stuck on the road, and then burned to death, still trying to get out. 100 dead is itself nothing much in the big picture, but it was a signal that something was horribly wrong. A signal that these were dangerous places to live. The lesson, for those who understood, was that these places were death traps. This contingent fact of history would have become a big part of why modernity collapsed. Anything one might say about the built environment, and I have just said much, became even more complicated by global heating. As things got hot in the concrete jungle, you couldn't survive without forced air cooling and continuous access to affordable electricity. On hot days, if the AC broke down, you had to evacuate to a cooling center maintained by city services. That's a lot of gearing to keep spinning during the best of times, and blackouts were becoming common. When things went sideways and nobody was left to maintain all this, people were stuck dealing with the heat. They could not survive without AC and electricity, so they died. That's all there was to it. This happened all over the world, in every nation with large cities, all at once. Millions, verging rapidly into billions, would have died in or near their homes. When the human world ended, I doubt that more than a few tens of thousands successfully escaped the built environment of Southern California. Escape from SoCal was always going to be nearly impossible, but nobody knew that because nobody ever took the few minutes to think it through. Not even the leadership. Anyone who had thought it through would have had to leave early, at a time when nobody else would have allowed themselves such thoughts. They would have moved quickly and gotten far away, thousands of miles, before everything imploded. That means without hesitation abandoning home, work, school, friends, family, and all their personal property, including cars, boats, and everything stuffed into the garage. After traveling for days or weeks, to then find a community with enough resources, housing in particular, but also a job market, welcoming a particular skill set, to let them settle in. Having a lot of money would have been critical, but they would need to make the required move before money became meaningless, as it is now. Having a private jet may have been useful, but only while airstrips had services for departures and arrivals, in particular jet fuel. All of it just to get out of SoCal ahead of the rush, and after they had managed an escape and taken on the financial and emotional costs, they still needed to make a go of surviving the collapse of global civilization, same as everyone else, as well as survive global heating, which is global, as implied. Did even a single person down SoCal way pull this off? I can imagine tens of thousands thought about it, but having just now written all the above, I must suppose that nearly nobody managed it end to end. Perhaps a few hundred very wealthy people, with their families, private jets, and what mementos they could carry with them, would have successfully accomplished a clean getaway, saving life and limb. It would have been tough, so perhaps not even 100, a score, a dozen. 3 families might have made it. From the entirety of SoCal, just 3 families. A number like that would have made no sense to people a year ago. 3 families out of 20 million people are escaping SoCal, and that's it? That's some alarmist pulp fiction, and not even original fiction. Claptrap. Keep your day job. It's only fiction until it isn't. After all of what has happened, nobody will return to Southern California, at least not for thousands of years. The ravages of global heating will kill everything for centuries. The concrete jungle will be populated by reptiles and small mammals, soon to become overgrown with grasses and hardy trees. The rest will have died. Any other imagined outcome for these millions of people trapped in the built environment with no way to get out is pure illusion. Had I written all that in the way I just did, but several years ago, nobody would have believed it at the time. All the evidence now suggests that it totally and completely turned out like that. SoCal is dead. Nearly everyone died, and that entire region will stay dead for a century to come. That's my story concerning the likely fate of SoCal. I hope someone proves me wrong, but I don't expect that to happen. Now back to the journalism, where it is still just day 6. Day 6. Too close to home. There was some kind of violence of a kind a few blocks away. I heard about it while I was taking a walk around the block. I came across some neighbors huddled as a group in the middle of the street, heads down and having a discussion. The story was that the local service station had run out of gasoline a few days before, and someone desperate for fuel had lost their composure and shot the attendant. Nobody died, but everyone was rattled by it. Not that it mattered, but the station was closed due to a police investigation. They were also talking about the events of a few days back, south of downtown. I hadn't been paying much attention, so this was the first I had heard. Apparently, another service station had been looted and then set on fire. There were a series of home invasion robberies, and some other random fires had been set in the area. I hypothesized that the fires were intended to divert the police away from the robberies. That made everyone stop and think. Criminality, it seemed, was getting itself organized. While everyone else was left ruminating on the news, I mentioned we should create a mutual aid group. Things like establishing a phone tree and designating some homes as safe houses for anyone who has to run from danger. This was broadly agreed upon, and one of the older couples offered to get started pulling that together. We all shared our phone numbers and street addresses. I told those in attendance the digital entry code to the side gate of my property, with instructions to let themselves in and bang on any door they could find. And just like that, the ball was rolling. Not a day too soon, as it turned out. Note to Brigid. Crude oil had shot up to $180 per barrel on the day. With heavy volatility, the U.S. Congress passed a bill to halt domestic crude oil exports. The state of California launched an investigation into reports of hoarding of gasoline and diesel supplies. I don't know how you feel about it, but the very idea of an investigation sounds funny as hell to me. Day 7. Hardening and listening. In the morning, I woke up to a text message that my food shipment was on the way. I can't tell you how much of a relief that was. It cost me a small fortune, but I had not a single complaint. For the record, that food supply lasted more than a month, and looking back, may have saved all our lives. The rest of the day was more digging in. Having already been warned that people were probing for resources, around here we call that situational awareness, I strengthened the front fence and protected the back of it with some concertina wire I had bought a few years ago, just in case. Yeah, that's how I operate. From the front, you couldn't see the razor wire, but anyone trying to climb the fence would have to deal with it on the way down. Either way, it works for me. The police scanner I ordered showed up in the afternoon, and in the evening I set it up. I listened to it for a while, subsequently, and what I heard going on was sobering, to say the least. Home invasions, arson, retail break-ins didn't seem normal to me, but I hadn't been paying much attention up to then. I will be paying a lot more attention going forward. At bedtime, I could smell smoke. Went outside, and it was from somewhere close. It smelled like burning wood, but also some plastic or rubber, and that meant a structure fire. I didn't hear any sirens. Given what I had been hearing on the police scanner, I figured they would let it burn. There was already nothing left to save, as we learned over the next week or two. By day 7, the collapse of global industrialized civilization was in full swing. I knew it, and the neighbors knew it. Nobody was talking about it, but we knew. There was smoke in the air without fire engines rolling, violence without the police showing up. Shots were being fired, cars were careening down the streets. On my scanner, there were so many 911 dispatches coming in that most would have gone without a response. The wheels were coming off in a big way, and nearly everyone knew it. Those who saw this as an opportunity for personal enrichment were already hard at work. The story of public safety. I've already said something about the built environment and how long it lasted without the wrapper of modernity. A key part of the infrastructure story was always public safety. Where I live, that used to mean police, fire, ambulances, highway patrol, county sheriffs, and the state National Guard. As with everything else, it could only last as long as the professional class felt comfortable dedicating their time and attention to the mission. From my personal experience of it, police and fire protection lasted a bit over a week after the modern world failed us. Not because they didn't have the fuel or equipment to roll. A week is not a long time when those are concerned. Rather, the men and women who were sworn to protect the public found themselves with competing problems at home, where their families were having to deal with the emerging catastrophe in food and fuel. I don't blame the police and firefighters for giving up. It was the correct call. Whatever the reason, they stopped coming to work and instead focused on getting their families to safety. I don't know when the hospitals failed, but it must have been early on. After the first few days of the collapse, I did not see or hear ambulances on response calls. I heard from news reports that hospitals were being overrun and one of our regional medical centers had been ransacked and set on fire. The most elderly and chronically ill members of society would be the first to fall to all this disorder. Some people need access to medications just to survive every day, as well as treatments like kidney dialysis. Without refrigeration, insulin supplies have a short shelf life, as do many antibiotics. Supply chains for medical supplies would have collapsed along with everything else. Even before the crisis, most Americans lived in underserved communities, lacking clinics or proper walk-in care. These people would rely on hospital emergency rooms for routine support. All of this went underwater during the early days of the onset of chaos. Shortly after, most hospital emergency wards would have ceased operations, and their staff would have stayed home. What happens when someone dies? In the past, you could call 911 and wait for someone to show up. So what happens when nobody shows up? You have a body on your hands, probably someone you cared about. Now you're stuck. At what point do you stop calling 911? When they stop answering the phone? At what point do you have to dispose of the body yourself, and how do you do that? Do you have a shovel? Can you dig a grave? Would you even bother? Under these circumstances, most bodies would go uncollected, unburied, and left to rot. The living might be forced out of their own homes because they wouldn't know what to do with a dead body, while in other cases, bodies would start to accumulate in the streets and in backyards. The smell of death is a potent motivator. Humans seem about as sensitive to rotting flesh as are animals we think of as scavengers. It is broadly accepted that early humans used to raid the kills of more powerful predators, driving off killers like lions and hyenas to steal their meals. This is also why humans have such acidic stomachs, so we can consume carrion without being poisoned by the bacteria. As such, our capacity to sense death at a distance and to react strongly to this means that having numerous dead bodies around us is a big deal. We are aware, and we react. Modern civilization had, for centuries, created a situation where nearly nobody had to experience this. Soldiers on battlefields had a different situation, but soldiers also had their lives forever changed by war, meaning by death. The quaint notion of personal property was an early casualty of the big slide. They tell us that locks are for honest people. That might be true while laws have any bearing, meaning where the chance of getting caught breaking the law remains high. When chaos and disorder take over, when civility is set aside, any prior agreements on what constitutes civil behavior evaporate. This transition can happen almost instantly, certainly in just a few days. At their core, everyone has an unexplored capacity for criminality. Some people, and this can be anyone, adopt any collapse of the rule of law with extravagant enthusiasm. They'll go on to create as much additional chaos as they can take advantage of. Chaos and disorder are self-reinforcing, and as such are the context of civilizational collapse. The tragic irony here is that everyone, including the criminal class, relies on civil behavior to survive and profit. This is essentially true of how people live within the set of agreements we call modernity, how they live within the built environment. During a riot, a thief can steal a 70-inch television and take it home. But they will have accomplished little if the next day their home has no electricity or it burns down. Robbing a bank might be easy during a large-scale interruption of lawful behavior, but if in the following week money has no meaning and there's nothing to buy with it anyway, then what was the point of robbing the bank? The expectation of the criminal class is that eventually the crisis will pass. Civility will be enforced again, and whoever was able to materially improve their situation will be allowed to retain their gains after the fact. Possession being 9/10 of the law, and all that. The criminal class was always the most optimistic about the sanctity of civil order, if only because they relied the most on it. Not in the practice of order, of course, but in the expectation that order will protect everyone equally, including the criminal class. I can say now, from the vantage point of this post-collapse world, that the criminal class, or if you'd rather, the criminal impulse, was completely betrayed by the persistence of widespread incivility. Criminality ground itself to a halt. It wasn't the dedication of the police, nor the fearlessness of the fire brigades, that brought criminality to an end. It was simply the civil order they needed for survival never returned. Without order, even the criminal class floundered. Stated more bluntly, the criminal class in particular was betrayed by unrelenting chaos. These were people with the fewest resources, the least preparedness, and the least room to maneuver. Their chronic desperation lent them the narrowest focus, being on bleak, mindless consumerism, even as the scaffolding of the consumerist dream fell down around their heads. In the opening days of the big slide, People were breaking into homes, stealing appliances, furniture, clothing, and jewelry at the very moment they should have been securing land and seed for their future food supply. Without those provisions, they slowly and inevitably perished, their ill-gotten goods unable to feed them. Whose fault is that? The collapse of the modern human world meant that most of us would die regardless, whether they embraced chaos or not. Nearly all of those lost were entirely unprepared for survival outside of civil order, outside of modernity and the built environment. Civility and modernity. For centuries on end, we dwelt there, safe and happy. For most of us, it certainly worked, but only until it didn't. Day 8. No food. Midday, I walked down to the supermarket to see what could be had. I'd heard some rumors about the shelves being empty and wanted to see for myself if that was the case. I also wanted to get a sense of the situation on the ground, and a short walk seemed like the best way to capture that. There was very little traffic on the streets. I passed a recently burned out car halfway to the market. Maybe that was the source of the smoke I got a whiff of the day prior. For the first time ever, I noticed dogs running loose in the streets, mostly larger dogs in packs of 3 to 6. They were either escaping or were being let loose by their previous owners. The market was open, but they were only letting people in a few at a time. This reminded me of the COVID-19 restrictions. I waited in line and listened to the conversations being had around me. I sensed a lot of anxiety. In about a minute, I heard enough to reconstruct the picture. The east side of town was almost cleaned out of food and supplies, and many of the smaller markets had been looted and left burning. People were driving 100 miles or more just on the rumor of stores still having food. As I waited in line to get in, I reminded myself how this had been anticipated. It was widely pointed out that once the fossil fuels stopped, you'll have another week of food on the shelves and then nothing. It was beginning to look like we hadn't lasted even that long. I got into the store and found the employees rationing what little was left. Some canned things, rolls from the bread aisle, and fruits and vegetables. The latter didn't look too good. I took what was offered and paid cash at the register. One shopping bag of goods, half full, and it cost a bit over $100. I didn't question it. On the way out, there were 2 men, one on either side of the automatic door, both of them asking to buy my groceries for any amount I cared to name. They looked equal parts earnest and desperate. White men, well-dressed, clearly not used to begging for food, and, like the rest of us, never could have imagined needing to do so. I hesitated, instinctively not wanting to part with anything, but then thought better. I gave each man a can of green beans from my bag and a can of diced tomatoes. That was all the canned goods I had. They both thanked me. One offered me a $20 bill and the other a handful of smaller bills. I bid them keep their money and wished them good luck. It felt good, while it also made me a little sad. If this was their last stand, then their prospects were not good. On the way home, I stayed off the main road and instead walked the neighborhood back streets, trying not to attract attention from anyone driving past and seeing an old guy with a bag of groceries. I gave the neighborhood a good inspection while I was about it. Some places were boarded up. Most others just looked empty. Were the people bugging out, or were they just lying low? It was impossible to say. Either choice made as much sense. I got home, and my wife and I sat down to a simple lunch of rice and beans and some of the rolls I had bought at the market, with fresh sugar pod peas from the garden. She was pleased with the fruits and vegetables. I didn't mention the canned goods I'd given away. To be honest, I had already forgotten about them and just now remembered as I write this. While we ate, the police scanner chattered away in the background. It didn't sound good at all. As we ate, I mentioned the burned-out car. Otherwise, we didn't talk much. Far away, in every direction, was the wail of sirens. After that day, I would never hear the like again. City services were already in terminal collapse. The neighborhood committee, as I came to think of it, called a meeting for that afternoon. I went mostly to listen, as I wasn't sure where everyone's head was at. The conversation was of no real substance, mostly complaining about the difficulty finding gasoline and the price being over $10 per gallon when you did. Well, complaining is a luxury, isn't it? I didn't state the obvious, that fuel at any price would shortly vanish, likely forever. I doubt they would have taken a comment like that as anything apart from more pulp fiction. Toward evening, my wife called her siblings living on the East Coast. It was late in the day where they were, but that's the most likely time to catch them. She didn't, and left voice messages. We also called my family, all of them on the West Coast. We had no better luck reaching them. My best guess is that all the phone circuits are busy, and nobody is getting through now the way we used to. Note for Brigid. Crude oil hit $364 per barrel about now. Airlines were grounded, apparently globally, partly because of fuel shortages, but mostly because of violence at airports. Foreign deployed elements of the U.S. military were being recalled by order of the President. Day 9. Who hesitates is lost. My food shipment arrived from SoCal. The driver, looking harassed, came to the door and asked me where I wanted it, and I pointed to the driveway. Using an electric hand truck, he unloaded a plastic-wrapped wood pallet piled high with sacks and boxes and dropped it on the bricks. He handed me some paperwork listing the inventory of my purchase, and I could see there were going to be 2 pallets. He then went back to his truck and lifted his material handler into the back. I was expecting him to come back with the second pallet. Instead, he slammed down the roll-up door, jumped into the cab, and drove off. So that's how it was going to be. Either he had helped himself to the other part of my shipment, or someone else had taken it. I was pissed at first, but then I realized I was lucky to have anything at all. That's when it came home to me, how everything that had seemed normal was being stretched out of shape, made unfamiliar. I also wondered if the driver had his home in Southern California, and if he were making plans to get out. On this day, I wrote on the inside wall of the garage in large spray-painted letters, "Who hesitates is lost." Hesitation is akin to fear, where fear makes us freeze up. If I hadn't placed the order, if the distributor hadn't gone the extra mile to find me a hauler, if I hadn't greased the wheels with more cash, or if the driver had simply headed home with the entire lot, any of those wrong turns in the process, and I would have had ended up with nothing whatsoever. I was indeed lucky. Amazingly so, it seemed to me. Without thinking too much more about it, I broke open the shipment and carted the loose bits behind the side yard gate. From there, I had time to haul everything into the basement. It took the rest of the day. I kept the pallet for the wood. Our committee met just after noon. There was more news about city services closing up shop and problems with cell phone services. Home internet access was becoming sketchy, and common websites were offline. This came as a surprise. Cell towers are heavy infrastructure. To see them faltering without there being a big event like an earthquake left me baffled. Same with the residential internet. It was an early sign of how vulnerable all this really was, as we would confirm later. I tried to call my brother again. No luck. This was not looking good. Brigid. Crude oil hit $482 per barrel today, and all trading was stopped indefinitely. None of us knew it at the time, but the global crude oil-based economy had been destroyed. And I think I will stop there. So that was me reading from my novel. It was 100 Days, an end of civilization novel. Again, this is a little bit of practice for me. I intend to do the entire audiobook, not in this studio. This is not the place to do it. and I have to work on that. But also I need to practice. So I will play this back and listen to myself reading, working on my microphone settings and if this is even the right microphone to use and other things. So will I come back and do another reading? How far did I get? Day 10. Yeah, maybe. We'll see. I need more practice, obviously. So I will probably come back and do some more practice, and I might read another 2 or 3 chapters. So that's that. Thank you for being here. I hope you got to the end. If you did, or even if you didn't, leave a comment what you thought about it. I mean, I can't change the book. It's too late for that. But let me know if you're interested in the audiobook. And if I don't do any more readings, nevertheless, I'll be back on here to announce when the audiobook is available, where it's available, how to get to it. If you're interested in that, it's probably going to be on Audible. So if you have an Audible account, you'll probably have access to it. And that's all for me. Thank you for being here. Like and subscribe, and we'll see you again.